Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing a Lae'zel build that I've been waiting to do ever since the mod manager got announced. The Psi-Warrior. Basically, a new mod got dropped onto the mod manager, available for both console and PC, which adds almost all of the fighter subclasses from D&D 5th edition into Baldur's Gate 3, and it is amazingly implemented. Whenever I'm kind of look at these mods that I use in my videos, I always vet them. I try to go for tabletop content first. I make sure they're balanced. I make sure they work effectively and all that, yada yada yada. And let me just say, this works immensely well. All of the subclasses feel extremely balanced and fit into the game so naturally that it honestly just feels like vanilla content. The mod creator absolutely should be patting themselves on the back for an amazing job. A link to it will be in the description below. But before I get into any of that, I will just say that the mod is missing two subclasses. It's missing Arcane Archer, because that's going to be coming officially in patch 8, and Echo Knight, because that is being worked on by another mod developer, and hopefully that'll come to console at a later date. However, we now have a ton of new toys to play with, so don't be surprised if my next few videos end up being fighter videos in some shape or form. I've got a lot of ideas that I want to work with, and I've got so many new toys to play with. Please just let me use them. But yes, we are making a Lae'zel origin build today using the Psi-Warrior subclass for fighter. The class itself is heavily tied to the Githyanki, so it just made sense to build it with Lae'zel, as well as the fact that I have managed to meld the psionic abilities of the Psi-Warrior with a bunch of equipment that we're going to be using in this build to create a really fun, interesting tank playstyle. There will be times with this build where you will just be able to walk up to a Steel Watcher's greatsword and take 0 damage. This build is extremely fun. And it is also going to show off what the mod is about, the capabilities of the mod, and kind of just, if you want to try it out for yourself, you could consider this a mod showcase as much as it is a build as well. So I really hope you will enjoy this video, and let's get into it. First off, obviously Lae'zel is a Githyanki, meaning that we're going to get things like astral knowledge to make us a bit more proficient in skills, which is nice, mage hand as a cantrip, as well as the ability to gain armor and weapon proficiencies, but that doesn't really matter for us specifically because we are playing as a fighter today. Speaking of, we're playing as a fighter, meaning that we're going to be getting things like weapon and armor proficiencies. Everything in the game is available to us as far as that's concerned. We're also going to get constitution saving throw proficiency, which is actually going to be really good for this build, as there is a spell that I want to concentrate on here, but I think is going to really benefit the build overall. And of course, you could always grab the Darkfire Shortbow and concentrate on haste as well, but I got something a bit different today. This also means we're going to gain access to Second Wind, which, because we are a tank build and we're going to be reducing the damage we take a lot, the healing from this is actually going to feel a lot more valuable, as a lot of the time it's actually just going to be able to take us back up to full, which is really, really nice, so I'm quite happy to grab Second Wind here. We also get to pick a fighting style, and contrary to what most people might be thinking, no, we're not going with great weapon fighting today. Normally I build Lae'zel, and I think most people do, as a two-handed weapon, big, great sword, smash build with great weapon master, right? And as much as those builds are fun, the playstyle that I've gone for today is a bit different, because I wanted to basically just make a more unique Psi-Warrior build, rather than just saying, here's your classic Lae'zel build, but you have different subclass features. You know what I mean? So I've decided to leave Great Weapon Master behind for now, although there will be an option to do that with this build when I show off the equipment later. But for now, I would say you have two solid options for your fighting style of choice. Dueling, which is what I'll be using for this build, to add an additional 2 damage with our one-handed or versatile weapon, as long as we don't have any other weapons in our offhand, but we can use a shield, which is what we're going to be doing today. This is a sword and board build. We also have the defense fighting style for a +1 to armor class if you want a bit more tankiness with this build, and you might see the value in picking this up when you see the equipment that we have a bit later, but for now, I think dueling is the best way to go. As for our ability scores, we have a bit of a weird spread here, but trust me, it will make sense. Strength is at 17 because we're going to be bumping this up with a half feat later. Dexterity is at 8. Now, if you've been on the channel long enough, you'll probably think, okay, he's put dexterity at 8. He is going to be bumping up his dexterity with the gloves of Dex, right? No. This build has dexterity at 8, and it is going to stay there, because that's just how the stats worked out. And you may be thinking, well, that's ridiculous, but I'm going to tell you right now, it works for this build. Yes, those low dexterity saving throws means that things like Fireball are going to be hitting us for full damage, but reminder, we are a tank build. We're meant to be taking hits, and in fact, this build actually benefits from being attacked by our enemies first, which is a weird thing to say, I know, but so the fact that we're going to be low in the initiative order doesn't actually matter. Like, it's hard to explain until I actually get further into the build and kind of explain my reasoning, but trust me, it actually is perfectly fine to have dexterity at 8 in this case. Sometimes you have to think a little bit outside the box when making these builds, and the way the stats work out in the end is perfect for what we're trying to do. Constitution is at 16 because I want a high hit point pool because we are meant to be a tanky build, and for those concentration saving throws. Intelligence is at 15 because we're also going to be bumping this up with a half feat later. That's why we have to have dexterity at 8, because I had to set this to 15 instead of 14 like I normally would. That leaves our wisdom and charisma both at 8. Wisdom is a little bit iffy, as it does mean that those tricky wisdom saving throws are going to be really easy to land on us, so you do need to be a bit careful about that in some situations. Maybe the amulet of the harpers would be good to get advantage on those saving throws, but again, you'll kind of have to see if that works out for you. There may be some stat adjustment to be made here. It's up to you if you want to kind of finagle that around. The wisdom being at 8 is kind of an issue for this build, I won't lie. However, I didn't have much issues with it in my actual testing when I usually test these builds solo, so feel free to kind of see how it goes, but there's obviously room to change things about in this build. Maybe the amulet of greater health in the end game, slap it on this build, and then put those other stats up. You know, there's plenty of options around. And finally, the charisma is also at 8 as well, because we don't really need it on this build, and Lae'zel is not exactly the most charismatic person outside of intimidation, so this is our final stat spread. We also have skill proficiencies here. Because Lae'zel is a soldier, she has the athletics and intimidation proficiencies automatically. Athletics is great for this build, intimidation kind of meh, but at least it's not in the negatives. That leaves us with history and perception for my skill proficiencies of choice, as I think those make the most sense for her in this case, but overall, it's up to you. At fighter level 2, you're going to gain access to action surge. You all know what this does. It gives you a whole extra action, meaning that by the time this build is done, you'll be able to make 6 attacks in a turn, which is pretty damn good. At fighter level 3, we get to choose our subclass, and look at it! Look at all the options that we have now. It's beautiful, it's amazing. I am so happy. This is how happy I'm going to be when patch 8 comes out as well, because look at all the options I now have. Turned into Jeremy Clarkson for a minute there, please ignore. So, obviously in addition to the usual 3, we have a bunch of new subclasses, everything from Banneret to Sharpshooter, which was actually Unearthed Arcana. This and Brute both were, so we've got new things to play with that most people probably haven't even heard of before. But we've also got the standards like Cavalier, Samurai, Rune Knight, and of course, Psi-Warrior. Psi-Warrior is going to give us a bunch of new things to play with, but let's read the description first. Awaken to a psionic power within. A Psi-Warrior is a fighter who augments their physical might with psi-infused weapon strikes, telekinetic lashes, and barriers of mental force. Many Githyanki train to become such warriors, as do some of the most disciplined high elves. So of course, this subclass is directly entrained with the Githyanki as a whole, which is why I wanted to make this a Lae'zel build, because I think it makes sense for her character arc if you go down the betrayal of Vlaakith and then eventually the Orpheus route, because I like the idea of when she kind of stops being a mindless drone in service to Vlaakith, she actually starts to develop her own abilities, going more down that kind of three-thinking route, which awakens her own mental abilities. So maybe you could play this build as like a champion or a battle master or whatever, normally, until you get to the point where she renounces Vlaakith or things start to change, like maybe after the Githyanki Kresh, and then respec into a Psi-Warrior if you kind of wanted to follow that kind of narrative pathway for this build. Otherwise, I absolutely love the Psi-Warrior here. It's going to give us a ton of stuff, so let's get into it, because it is quite mechanically different from some of the other other fighter builds. So first up, we have a brand new resource, Psionic Energy Die. Psi-Warriors harbour a wellspring of psionic energy within themselves that fuel the various psionic powers they have. You have a number of psionic energy die equal to twice your proficiency bonus. So by the time this build is done, you will have 8 psionic energy die at max fighter level. This is pretty good. They come back on a long rest, however, so you do need to be a bit resource efficient. But don't worry, we have ways of doing that with this build. As you'll see when we get into some of the later features, you'll be able to see that we have ways of getting some of these die back. Moving on, we have Protective Field. Creates a momentary shield of telekinetic force that reduces incoming damage. This works similarly to Shield. As a reaction, you'll spend a psionic energy point to reduce incoming damage, basically allowing you to tank more damage than normal. We're going to be stacking this with some equipment features, but with the fact that we'll also have really high HP as a high level fighter with a decent chunk of constitution, you're going to be able to tank hits pretty sufficiently. And finally, moving on, we have Psionic Strike. Once on each of your turns, when you damage a target within 9 meters with a weapon, you can spend a psionic energy die to deal an additional 3 to 8 force damage. This is dependent on your intelligence modifier, which is why we wanted it to be a bit higher. So yeah, overall you have a really solid option for defense and a really solid option for offense immediately at 3rd level. And that extra damage being force damage is really nice because barely anything in the game resists force damage. So you're always going to have a solid option to be able to break through enemy defenses. So overall, these two features together are really solid. You're going to be strong offensively and you're going to be strong defensively. Psionic Strike is also really important as it kind of works as a combo skill. Later on in the build, you'll be able to chain Psionic Strike into other actions, which will allow you to manipulate the battlefield in new ways. So it is a very important skill and will definitely be the main thing that you're going to be spending your psionic die on. However, the defensive option is going to work nicely for this build as well, because by the time this whole thing is done, you will be able to basically just take 0 damage from certain attacks when you need to. So it's very, very, very good. Moving on, we also have telekinetic movement. Move an object or an ally you can see up to 9 meters to an unoccupied space. Once you use this ability, you cannot use it again until you finish a short rest, or you can choose to expend a psionic energy die. So basically, with telekinetic movement, you get to move an object or an ally completely safely. So it's basically, the way they've done this in BG3, it's like the telekinesis spell where you essentially throw the ally or object, but in that moment you give it immunity to bludgeoning damage, meaning that they'll take no damage until they land. So it's pretty interesting actually how it's done, but this is a really great like kind of battlefield commander move, like a support move, where if your ally is in a tough position, you just get to move them, and it's forced movement, so it doesn't provoke opportunity attacks or anything like that. So if you partnered this build up with Shadowheart, ironically enough, and you see that she is in danger and she's supposed to be healing the party, boom, you just pluck her out and put her into a safe position. It can be high up, out of your enemy's way. Like, this is actually a really solid move, and the fact that you get this back every time you expend a psionic energy die is actually really nice. So you basically just get this ability back for free as you use your other features. So it's actually really, really good. And it lets you move objects as well. The caveat being, you may think, oh yeah, I'm just gonna freaking throw like objects at people, but it has to be on an occupied space. So unfortunately that doesn't really work, but if you do have like big objects in the environment that you would normally have to move with like a strength check or something, you can actually just do it with this ability, no problem. So it has a lot of environmental effects, but it's mainly used to kind of help support your allies, maybe get your frontline fighters into the front line a bit quicker, or pull your backline characters like Gale or Shadowheart into the backline a lot easier. So this may seem like kind of a meh ability at the start, but actually used in practice, it becomes very, very solid. So I definitely recommend using it as much as you can. Moving on, we also have Restore Psionic Energy Die. Once per short rest, as a bonus action, you can regain 1 Psionic Energy Die. So you get an extra 2 per long rest. So if you're in a situation where you just want to make sure you have that extra resource, or maybe you've run out, you just need a quick boost to get another thing going, you can just quickly get 1 back. So where it's technically you have 10 Psionic Energy Die per long rest, as opposed to the usual 8 by the time this build is done. So, you know, I would say it's pretty good. I would say this is definitely more powerful in the earlier levels where the resource is a bit more limited. Basically, just having that extra 1 on call per short rest is actually really nice. So, there you go. A solid set of subclass features right at 3rd level. At level 4, we get to choose our first feat of the build, and I'm going to be choosing one of 2 feats that are going to be half feats that are going to bump up our stats. And this is a feat that I don't think I've ever used on the channel before, Heavy Armour Master. Heavy Armour Master increases our strength by 1 to a maximum of 20, and incoming damage from non-magical attacks also decreases by 3 while you're wearing heavy armor. So not only is this going to round up our stat, which is kind of what I wanted it to do anyway, it's also going to give us a massive defense buff. Now, non-magical attacks will be a bit few and far between as you get towards the very late game. However, basically every single basic attack an enemy can do to you is non-magical, meaning in most encounters, especially in the kind of, like, I would say early to mid-game and into quite a bit of the late game as well, you're just going to be tanking so much damage. Between this and the protective field from Psi-Warrior, you're just going to be able to tank massive amounts of damage. And again, we're going to be getting some abilities later that are going to make this even more potent. So I was quite happy to use a feat that I've not really showcased on the channel before in this build, because I think it works so well. At fighter level 5, you're going to get extra attack. You already know what this does. At fighter level 6, we're going to get our bonus fighter feat, which is where we're going to be picking up our second half feat of the build. This one is probably pretty obvious, but we're going with Telekenetic. I like to think that around the time you get to level 6 of the build, Lae'zel is really starting to awaken to her psionic abilities a bit more. So this feat is going to allow you to bump up one of your mental stats by 1. So, of course, we're going to be bumping up intelligence, increasing the effectiveness of our psionic warrior abilities as well. We also get to learn the Mage Hand cantrip permanently, not just once per long rest like we do from Githyanki. And now, as a bonus action, you can telekinetically shove a nearby enemy. So if our bonus action is not being taken up by Second Wind or restoring a psionic energy die, now every bonus action, we just get to telekinetically move our enemies around the battlefield, either pushing them away from us or pulling them towards us. Now, with the amount of cliffs and drops that are in Baldur's Gate 3, you're going to be able to push a lot of enemies off of cliffs, or if that enemy is just out of your melee range, you get to do a little bit of a get over here type thing and just start smacking them with your sword. The fact that it's exclusively a bonus action and it doesn't take our our main action to do, makes this so viable. Now, obviously, for those of you who know Psi-Warrior, know that we're going to be getting an ability similar to this anyway, but it's still nice to have a free version of it that's not going to be resource dependent, that we can just do. It's a lesser version of what Psi-Warrior does, but it's the fact that it doesn't use resources, and also makes the stats of this build work out so much better, but I had to include it here. Speaking of, at fighter level 7, we're going to get some more subclass abilities. First up, we have Psi-powered leap. Propel your body forward with your mind and fly towards a target position. So yes, even though this says leap, it is actually basically the fly ability. So yes, you've just gained flight. You've gained a fly speed with this build. You use it as a bonus action and you move up to your movement speed. Yeah, no, Lae'zel is flying now. She flies now. Yeah, they fly now. So, stupid ass reference. But yeah, no, so this is a pretty awesome ability to have. Movement is obviously so important, both in tabletop and in Baldur's Gate 3, so the fact that we just now get to fly around the map as Lae'zel is amazing. It has the same restriction as telekinetic movement though, that once you use its ability, it can't be used again until you finish a short rest, but if you expend that psionic energy die, it comes back. So Psi-powered leap is a very fun movement option for us. Now we can move our allies and ourselves with ease. Also moving on to this, we now have the telekinetic thrust push and prone. These are very, very cool. Push the target of your psionic strike 3 meters horizontally from the direction of the position you select. Basically, so after hitting a psionic strike on an enemy, you can choose to push them away or knock them prone. So this is kind of where that combo comes in. So you hit someone with Psionic Strike, and then without having to expend any additional resources, you can either choose to push them away from you, similar to Telekinetic, or knock them prone. Obviously, knocking them prone is probably what you're going to be wanting to go for 90% of the time, because if you knock an enemy prone, that's advantage on all subsequent attacks you make, and again, you'll have 2 extra attacks by the time this build is done, both with advantage. As well as the fact that that means all of your allies will gain advantage on the attack as well, which is great. And of course, if you want to push them, you can, but remember, we can push and pull with just our bonus action. So really, I would say push is probably not going to be used as much, but being able to knock enemies prone is really nice. So yeah, we have a lot of forced movement with this build, which is just great for, you know, tabletop and Baldur's Gate 3 in general. Moving on to fighter level 8, we do get another feat at this point. Now, it's entirely up to you kind of how you want to go about your stats from here. I would say at this point, ability score improvements are probably going to be what you want to go for now that we kind of have our basic kit. Now, it's up to you if you want to bump up your strength to 20 here, if you want to just get the max out of your melee weapon attacks, which I can totally understand, but since we have it here at 18, if you're not using the Potion of Everlasting Vigor on anybody else, maybe put that here to max out your strength. Otherwise, I would say bumping up your Constitution or your Intelligence is going to be more beneficial in the long run. But now, I'm going to bump up our Constitution to make us more tanky. At fighter level 9, we're going to get Indomitable. Whenever you fail a saving throw, you can roll again using the new result instead. This is once per either short rest or long rest, forgive me, I seem to have forgotten in the moment, but this is still a useful ability. Now those wisdom and dexterity saving throws are a little bit less scary. They still suck, but hey, at least we got something to deal with it. At fighter level 10, we're going to gain another Subclass feature, that being Guarded Mind. We now have resistance to psychic damage, which is great for taking on mind flayers, as well as you can end effects on yourself that cause you to become charmed or frightened. So yeah, two of those nasty conditions that come from wisdom saving throws, we no longer have to deal with them because Guarded Mind is going to get rid of them for us. So now that lower wisdom score doesn't really matter as much, especially when you end up fighting a lot more mind flayers around this point in the game. At fighter level 11, we're going to get that improved extra attack, so now we can make 3 attacks in a turn. Now, I would say here you have a choice. You can either take the 12th level of fighter like I have to gain that extra feat and bump up an ability score, probably your intelligence. However, there is, I would say, room for a 1 level dip into barbarian here. What Barbarian would do would give you the ability to rage, which doesn't impact any of your Psionic warrior features as they're not spells, meaning that you would gain resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, making this build even more tanking, also being able to do a little bit of extra damage. I would say that there is room on this build for a 1 level dip of Barbarian if you choose, if you want to lean more into that kind of tanky aspect of the build. However, because I kind of want to keep this a pure, whoops, that wasn't meant to happen. Let's go back a sec. My apologies. Because I wanted to keep this more of a pure fighter build and grab that extra feat, I decided not to use it for my testing, but do know there's a little bit of room to shake things up with a 1 level dip here and there, so feel free to throw in some stuff that you think would be valuable to this build. However, I am going to be going for an ability score improvement and bumping up that intelligence to help our psionic abilities work a little bit better. And that is the build. What you're going to be getting out of this is just pretty much everything. You're going to be incredibly tanky, allowing you to take massive amounts of damage and reduce it to almost nothing, if not nothing at all. You're also going to have a ton of movement, both for your allies and yourself, being able to fly around the battlefield and move your allies safely to advantageous positions. You're also going to be a massive damage dealer. You're a full level fighter, you're getting 3 attacks per turn, up to 6 with Action Surge. Not to mention, again, a lot of your extra damage from Psionic Strike can be used to fuel other powerful abilities. And again, you're a tank, you're going to be resisting a ton of damage and able to heal yourself as well for a significant amount. So overall, you're just getting a bit of everything with this build, but you're good at all of it. It's definitely worth having around. But let's look at the equipment to see where this build really starts to come into its own. First up, my choice of weaponry. We're going sword and board with this playstyle, as I said, and for my sword of choice, I went with Voss's Silver Sword. It just fits too well for Lae'zel, especially going down the route that I think this build would, eventually allying yourself with Voss, and he will give you his weapon in Act 3. This weapon is awesome, it's one of the only +2 longswords in the game, dealing an extra 1d4 psychic damage. It also grants itself an additional 1d4 bonus to damage and attack rolls against Githyanki, aberrations, fiends, and elementals. I mean, that's everything Lae'zel would want to hunt down in a single playthrough in one weapon, so overall, it works really nicely. It also comes with a usage of Wrathful Smite once per short rest, allowing you to potentially frighten targets and deal even more psychic damage. This will cost you concentration though to maintain the frightened condition, but otherwise you can kind of just use it once and forget. It also comes with all the usual longsword stuff, including Rush Attack, which I think is extremely underrated. Very, very fun ability. So yeah, overall, I think that that is a pretty solid weapon to go with, but any one-handed or versatile weapon will work for this build, so pick your poison, because you mainly want to be pairing it with the Swire's Sledboard. Again, probably never featured this on the channel before, but I'll tell you what, it's a damn good shield. It's got a +2 to your armor class like most standard shields, and the usual shield bash ability, which is always nice to have. However, this comes with a unique ability. The shield shrouds the wearer with Force Conduit at the start of its turn in combat. So this will give you 2 turns of the Force Conduit status effect every time you it comes up to your turn in initiative. Now, what Force Conduit does is it reduces the damage of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing against the affected target, so us, by 1 per turn. So just at the start of your turn, you're getting your any damage from those attacks reduced to you by 2. So pretty good. If the entity takes damage while it has 5 or more turns remaining, it deals 1d4 force damage in a 6-meter radius. So now we have this force shield around us at all times, basically like an aura of force that reduces damage towards us with each turn that we take, eventually exploding in a psionic burst around us. I mean, come on, how could I not use Force Conduit for this build? It just makes too much sense. Now, this works in a similar way as something like Lightning Charges or Reverberation, that once that Force Damage burst goes off, you do lose your Force Conduit charges. But again, we're gaining them at the start of every turn, and we have more ways of gaining them. And this can stack up to 7 turns of Force Conduit, which means a potential -7 to any damage that comes towards us, as long as it's bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage. But this status condition also has some pretty unique interactions surrounding it, so otherwise, it's pretty interesting, and I'll get to some of those interactions as we go further with the build. But overall, this is going to be a centerpiece for the build once you reach the late game and are able to obtain it. So I would definitely say you're going to want to pick this up as soon as you can. However, in the early game, you have an interesting option called the Skin Burster. This weapon, whenever the wielder deals melee damage with this weapon, they gain 2 turns of Force Conduit. So basically now, for attacking, you'd gain Force Conduit as well, which as a 4-level fighter could be pretty potent. So if you want to use this instead of the Sword and Shield, you absolutely can. This is a +1 weapon that is obtained, ironically enough, in the Githyanki Crash in Act 1. So it's a perfect early game weapon to start fueling this playstyle. Again, probably around the time where you would want to respec into this build if you're following that narrative arc, you'll get this weapon, so you can really start to feel the playstyle coming through early on. Of course, with it being an early game weapon that's a bit weaker on the actual offense department, I would maybe suggest bumping this up with the Drakethroat Glaive once you get to Act 2. However, as well, if you wanted to use this weapon like as your primary weapon throughout the whole build, definitely use the Drakethroat Glaive, but also pick up Great Weapon Master somewhere along the line with this build. Maybe replace Heavy Armor Master and go with that instead, manipulating your stats a little bit to make that work. Maybe the Hair of Auntie Ethel can be thrown in there somewhere. I would say that this takes a little bit more kind of finagling to get working effectively, but if you do, this is definitely a potent option, so I absolutely recommend it for this build. Otherwise though, I do like the reliability of the sword and board strategy more, so that was what I decided to focus on with the endgame for this build. Moving on to the actual equipment, we have the Circlet of Psionic Revenge. This is just a perfectly good, lore-fitting option for Lae'zel. Whenever you succeed a saving throw, the foe that caused that throw takes 1 to 4 psychic damage, so you can actually manually trigger this with Indomitable, which is kind of funny. Githyanki also gain a +1 bonus to Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma saving throws, so it helps kind of patch up our low saving throws a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. This is a free slot. Put whatever you like here. Good endgame options could be the Mask of Soul Perception for a bit of a bonus to your initiative and attack rolls and all that. But I did think this was a solid option to just include overall in the build, especially since you can get it quite early in the game. And I think it just fit too well for the build lore-wise not to include it here, and it does have legitimate use, but there may be some better late game options out there if you want to change it up. Moving on, we have the Cloak of Protection. Our armor in this build has a slightly lower base armor class, so I did want to include some sort of armor class buff in this build, and so the Cloak of Protection helps. It's going to give us a +1 bonus to our armor class and saving throws, again patching up those lower saving throws, and also giving us a better armor class. It's just too good for this build for me not to include. Moving on, we have the Rippling Force Mail, the cornerstone of this build. A base 17 armor class, which is low for heavy armor, which is why we have these methods of bumping it up. However, whenever we take slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning damage, we gain 2 turns of Force Conduit. So, in a way, we're just going to have a ton of Force Conduit. The more attacks we take, the less damage they will do to us. And as you will have seen in the combat footage, this results in a pretty goddamn tanky build overall. So, yeah. This is just one of the best ways to gain Force Conduit, but if you feel like the shield or maybe even the Skin Burster alone are doing it for you, you can swap it out, but I did want to include it in this build so we can really lean into the playstyle that I'm trying to achieve here. And again, this is obtained pretty early into Act 2. Right after you get the Skin Burster, you're probably getting this pretty much immediately, so I definitely recommend this overall anyway, but you do have some other options there. Moving on to our gloves. A pair of gloves that I don't think I've ever featured on this channel before, correct me if I'm wrong, the Cinder Snap gloves. This is going to allow us to cast a spell called Protection from Missiles, allowing us to amplify our reflexes to better contend with incoming missiles. Raised weapon attacks against you have disadvantage, and their damage is halved. It can be used once per short rest, last 10 turns, or until your concentration on it breaks. But as a fighter with Icon, that's very rare to happen unless you get knocked prone by a Steel Watcher, like I did in the combat footage. So, but I kind of wanted to make this, like, kind of part of our psionic ability. Like, it's kind of the Jedi thing, right? Where, you know, there's a bunch of stormtroopers in front of you, and, like, they're firing their laser blasters at you, and you're just deflecting them with either, like, the Force itself, or, like, your Jedi powers. Like, come on, this is a Jedi, let's be real. Psi-Warrior is just a Jedi. But, like, the idea of being able to block, like, ranged attacks with your Force abilities is just such, like, a psychic warrior thing to do that I wanted to include it on this build in some shape or form, and Protection from Missiles does exactly that. At the very start of the combat footage, you actually do see it being effective, as it caused all of those ranged attacks against us to miss right at the very start, but of course we did lose concentration immediately after, because Steel Watchers. Really hate them, but they're the best thing to test builds on. So yeah, but I really wanted to include this here in this build. But of course, this is kind of a niche effect that's more about, you know, the lore and just kind of, you know, filling the theme. So if you want to go with something that's a bit more powerful, like the Gloves of Dexterity, the Legacy of the Masters, you know, any of those powerful gloves that fighters love to wear, go for it. But you can't deny that the roleplay function of Protection from Missiles and the mechanical function, it makes you way more of a tank with this build as well, is just too good to pass up, so I highly recommend that you use these for a bit of a change of pace. And finally, moving on to the boots, we have the Boots of Psionic Movement. Whenever a Githyanki casts Fly, which unfortunately our Psionic Movement does not count, it's a bit of a letdown, our next melee weapon attack will deal an additional 1d4 psychic damage, but it does give us the ability to use Fly as well, once per long rest, and it'll let us fly for 10 turns, so it does give us a bit more movement options as well. However, this is more here for the lore kind of side of things. As I said, that extra bit of psychic damage and the ability to fly around a bit more freely is nice, especially since this version of Fly does not take on concentration. However, if you're not too into this, if you think this is kind of meh, grab the Disintegrating Lightwalkers in Act 1. This is also your early game option as well. This means you cannot be enwebbed, entangled, or ensnared and cannot slip on grease or ice. Yeah, it's too good, especially with this low dexterity that we have. This pair of boots just makes the most sense. Not to mention, it also gives us Misty Step once per short rest, and since Githyanki gain Misty Step innately from their race once per long rest, having more uses of it does kind of make sense. So, looking back on it, the Disintegrating Lightwalkers are the more powerful option overall, and probably even make more sense lore-wise. However, the Psionic Movement boots are the kind of road less taken, shall we say, and I wanted to include them in this build, and yes, they do work really well, but I think the Nightwalkers just are the better choice overall. Another option for your cloak that you could go for is the Nymph Cloak in Act 3 to give you Dominate Person if you want another powerful concentration-based spell that kind of fits into like the more psychic side of things rather than the psionic side of things, which are two different things, kind of, believe it or not. But yeah, so that's another option for you, but I kind of like the Cloak of Protection more here overall. Moving on to our amulets, this is a free slot, but I did also grab the Amulet of Misty Step to give us another short rest Misty Step as well. Combining these, you would have 3 Misty Steps per long rest and an extra 2 per short rest. So overall, you'd have a lot more kind of free movement around the battlefield if you need it. Otherwise, feel free to replace this with whatever. Once you hit Act 3 and you don't want to use it on another character, the Amulet of Greater Health would obviously work great here. You can dump your Constitution and then fix your Dexterity and Wisdom stats as you see fit, but otherwise the Amulet of Misty Step is just a great option overall. Combining this as well with the Ring of Free Action is also great. You ignore the effects of difficult terrain and cannot be paralyzed or restrained. This just means that you'll be able to just have complete freedom of movement, and I think that works great like if you have that like aura of force around you, meaning that things that try to entrap you just can't, and being able to get over difficult terrain even without like flight is also a really nice feature. But again, this is kind of a free slot, feel free to swap it out. Maybe the Strange Conduit Ring if you want a little bit more damage while concentrating on protection from missiles. And finally, the Ring of Jumping. Again, it's another free slot, but it gives you an extra casting of Jump, which is Enhanced Leap, once per short rest, which again, Githyanki get normally from their racial feature, but it's once per long rest for them. It's just another base Githyanki racial feature similar to the Amulet that we just get to use more often. It just kind of boosts up what Lae'zel is innately, which is why I wanted to include it on this build. But again, it's a free slot. Feel free to change that out for something else that you find to be more effective. As I said, we don't have a ranged weapon on this build, however the Darkfire Shortbow would be recommended here to give you the ability to use haste, which is great on any fighter, as well as the cold and fire resistance. So yeah, feel free to throw that on this build if you want, if you're not using it somewhere else. However, now I get to point out something fun, a fun interaction that can make this build defensive even for your allies. So, we have the True Love's Embrace and the True Love's Caress, 2 pairs of rings that allow one person who is wearing this ring to cast Warding Bond on the person wearing the other ring. But here's the question, why is this important to this build? Well, Warding Bond, for those of you who don't know, allows you to ward an ally, giving them resistance to all damage and a +1 bonus to their armor class and saving throws, which sounds amazing. However, it comes with a caveat. Each time the ally would take damage, you take the same amount of damage. So, overall, that sounds like a pretty big negative. Like, you're basically, yes, you're giving your ally a big boost to their defenses, but if your enemy is damaging 2 targets at once, that could be pretty bad, right? Well, this is where Force Conduit comes into play. So think about it this way, right? Your ally is resistance to all damage, and they gain a +1 bonus to their armor class. So even if they're taking the hit, they're going to take way less. Force Conduit reduces the damage that Warding Bond deals to the caster, meaning that if we have Force Conduit on ourselves and an ally that we've warded is taking damage, Force Conduit is reducing the damage done to us, meaning that that damage that is already being resisted by our ally is now even less, possibly even nothing, to us. I would flavor this as you are creating a psionic barrier, maybe extending that aura of force that we were talking about to an ally, meaning yes, you are psychically linked, meaning that you take the damage that they take as kind of like mental damage, but because your mind is so, you know, protected and it's like a steel trap, you just brush off the damage almost entirely. So I really liked this idea for this build. If you look at the wiki pages that I have linked in the description below, you'll see how this interaction works in full. It's explained a bit better than I have here, but basically just know that as long as you have stacks of Force Conduit and Warding Bond is up, you are going to be taking next to no damage, and it doesn't take your concentration, so you can still have this up at the same time as something like protection from missiles or haste. So you've got a lot of really interesting options here, but I really like this Warding Bond interaction. So while I didn't use it for my testing, because I usually test solo, I did do a little bit of team testing, and yeah, it works. It really works, and it will basically just make one of your allies near invincible in addition to yourself. So yeah, definitely use this interaction. If you want to really play on the irony, use it on Shadowheart, because that's kind of funny, and have Shadowheart be a healer. You're taking all the damage that she would take, and then she's healing you, making you two basically unstoppable. But yeah, moving on to the last kind of cosmetic stuff before we get into the kind of end of the video stuff. For the camp clothing that I have here, for the kind of transmog, we have 2 pieces of clothing here from Fear Taylor's camp clothing mod, also available to all platforms. We've got Orpheus's Honor Guard version 2, which in my opinion just makes sense for this build. This is the kind of special armor that you see the Honor Guard wearing when they attack you at the start of Act 3, as well as the Black Gauntlet of Bane boots, because I felt like they kind of matched the overall look quite nicely, and they're both coloured in the Vlaakith dye, meaning that we've got a little bit of everything from Githyanki history in this build, and top aside, I do think it kind of shows Lae'zel's progression, how she's gone from this, like, sort of heavily armoured, you know, drone of Vlaakith wearing the shiny, regal Githyanki armour, to something a bit more flexible and, like, is relying more on her psychic abilities to defend herself, which is why she's wearing, like, a lighter armour, and the colour scheme kind of matches the weapons that we've chosen a bit more effectively to make a nicer looking build. No, I did not just choose this armour because she's got her tits out, I promise. But yes, that is the build, and overall, I am so happy with this. Yes, at the end of the day, the build itself is pretty simple. It's 12 levels of fighter, but 12 levels of fighter is very good, and the way I just deliberately took all of the like stat allocation with the feats, and the you know, the abilities with the feats as well, and the abilities of the equipment all into account to just create a really fun playstyle overall, I'm super proud of this one. This is one of my favourite builds in recent memory. It works so bloody well at what it's supposed to do. Again, you are an amazing tank, you are an amazing damage dealer, you're just gonna be, you're like a weird mix of, like, battlefield support and raw, like, damage as well. Like, you just take the hits, you move your allies and enemies around pretty much freely, and then when you really need to, you just go in. And like I say, there's room for improvement on this build. The equipment that I've shown here is just stuff that I think works well, but you can take for more standard, powerful options to just take this build into even further if you want. I nerfed myself for this build video, and just to show how powerful it is, and in the combat footage you can see that there was never really an issue with HP. Yes, around the end we were kind of at the halfway mark, but nah, you can just tank so much damage with this build, it's insane. Again, the only issue this build could potentially have is with saving throws, but the equipment that we've picked helps with that quite a bit, and the fact that we get the Indomitable feature later on, where those saving throws are really going to matter, does help. So overall, this build really does work. And again, your main stats that you need are going to work great. Our intelligence saving throws, which makes more sense against mind flayers because of their stunning ability, and even the agents of Bane later on who can do a similar thing. It works really, really well, and there's even room for improvement with the stats, because you can do, like I said, the potion of everlasting vigor to make our strength 20 as well. So, you know, there's just so much you can do with this build, so feel free to play around, experiment, and enjoy, because this is such an interesting build with so many potentially cool interactions going on. Looking back on it, though, I definitely think I would recommend the Darkfire Shortbow for this build as a mainstay, because for when you've used protection from missiles, or if you think more offense is important, then having that option for haste is just so good. But yeah, that is going to do it for me for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.